Hi, my name is Nora Elder and I'm with ADVISA. Today we'll be talking about using the predictive index in interviewing for a job and how exactly that process works. So let's get started. Our mission at ADVISA is to improve the world one leader at a time. And we do that with a very strategic three-part model. Here at ADVISA, we believe that data is a great foundation to insight. And then we help our clients turn insights into strategic actions. Today, the data that we'll be considering is both PI behavioral data and job benchmark data. Those two types of data are crucial. People are what turn business strategy into business results. And so we use people and job data to ensure that we're hiring folks purposefully with our eyes wide open to the relationship they will likely have with their position. It is in this way that we can be sure that we have the optimal talent to move business forward. So, how does that work? You may have been asked to take a job assessment, which feels very much like the behavioral assessment. They're both stimulus response surveys, and both contain items that connect to each of the four drives of the PI. The key difference is that the job assessment lists out observable behaviors to choose from, like the ones that you can see on the screen, so that the end result paints a picture in PI terms of the personality of a job. Another way to say that is that the job assessment tells us clearly what behaviors are required in a role. This is what the output of a job assessment process looks like. Similar to a PI behavioral assessment, but instead of telling us about needs, it's telling us about the behaviors necessary for success in a role. If you've taken the job assessment, your results would show up down below. It's then up to the person managing the job benchmarking process to reconcile any differences between stakeholders' responses. That way, we can ensure that everyone is aligned on the role's expectations. When everyone has the same understanding of the role, then we can most effectively use that job pattern to hire, coach, and develop folks in that job. Let's talk a little bit more about why job patterns work so well. Let's think back to the principle that PI is built on, that people have drives. Those drives each create a set of needs, and that people will behave in ways to meet those needs. When those needs are met, a person gets energy and confidence. So, in a nutshell, PI tells us what folks need to give them energy and confidence and how they're likely to behave to get those needs met. This is why it is so helpful for a job pattern to lay out what set of behaviors is required to do a job successfully. By comparing both sides of PI, the person side and the job side, we can determine if a job will require a person to act in ways that are predictably natural to them, or if they'll have to adapt their behavior. If they have to adapt a behavior, it's likely that some need of theirs is going unmet by their job. Behavior, though, is a choice, and any human can choose any behavior. There are folks who succeed in jobs that don't meet every one of their needs. So the best way to dive into the fits and the gaps between a person's PI and the job that they're applying for is simply to talk to them about it. And we can use PI to help inform that conversation. The best practice methodology for interviewing a candidate is behavioral interviewing. The principle behind it is that for every key behavior that you need someone to display or act out in a role, you ask for an example of a time that that candidate has acted out that behavior in the past. Once you've asked that question, you then use the STAR method to listen to their response. First, you listen for a situation or a task. So, did the candidate clearly explain what the challenging situation or task was that they faced? Then you listen for the specific action. Has the candidate adequately explained what action that they took? And then finally, you listen for the result. This is oftentimes the part of their answer that candidates will leave out. So you may need to ask for a follow-up just to make sure that you know exactly what the result was. So has the candidate explained what result of their action was? The more clear of an example that your candidate can give, the more confident that you can be of your candidate's ability to behave that way again. This is because past behavior is a great indicator of future behavior. The PI software has a tool called the interview guide, and that is made specifically to help you interview your candidates using the behavioral interviewing technique. The report begins with a behavioral comparison between the person and the role, and then generates questions to ask the candidate, 2 questions per drive, based on whether the candidate is within range or out of range for that drive in your role. It allows you to use PI as a data point in the hiring process, but not as a determining factor of whether someone is qualified for a role. Rather, you can be sure to address the fits and the gaps between the person and the role, allowing you much better information to make your hiring decision. The questions on the interview guide are general, and they're meant to act as a jumping off point for your interview. To demonstrate what the interview guide does, let's walk through a case study. For our case study, we'll be looking at a software engineer position. So the graphic that you're looking at on the left is pulled from the job report, which is another useful tool from the website. It provides you with helpful language and things to look out for on the search for the right candidate for your role. It also tells you what a person with a PI that looks like that job pattern is likely to show up doing. Pretty cool, huh? So as we walk through the case study, we will look at 4 different candidates for the position, and each of them will have a different area of misalignment with the role. We will walk through the questions that the interview guide generates, and then talk through ways that you might be able to make those questions more relevant to your specific role. Before we dive in, it's useful to note that the interview guide asks probing questions anytime a candidate is out of range for a position, and confirming questions anytime a candidate is in range. Sometimes a candidate will be out of range, but on the same side of the midline as the job target, meaning that they will feel those needs associated with that drive just at a slightly different magnitude. This essentially means that not all gaps between a person and a job are cause for concern. It's still a good idea, though, to ask questions to be sure that that candidate can adapt. So let's dive in and look at some candidates. Here's our first candidate. At the top, you see the behavioral comparison between our first candidate and our job target. Then below are 2 questions specifically generated about the A drive, which is the only drive that's mismatched between our candidate and the job benchmark. If you were looking at the full interview guide, you would also see a list of confirming questions about the B, C, and D drive, but we're not focusing on those because those are more softball kind of confirming questions. Our job target calls for a situational A, so one that's flexible and adaptable around the behaviors that would be associated with the A drive. Our candidate's A drive is squarely low. Because there's not much difference between our candidate's A drive and the job benchmarks, it's pretty reasonable to believe that they're adaptable, but the interview guide has still given us good questions to ask to fill in that gap. As you can see below, the questions are pretty general, but get at important points. By asking for examples of times that the candidate had to lead a team or a project or initiate something new, we'll get a sense of times that that candidate had to adapt and behave as a higher A person would. These questions can serve as a jumping off point for more questions. For instance, what type of projects might a person have to lead in the software engineer role? You are welcome to make those questions more specific to meet your needs. For example, you might ask, tell me about the last engineering push you did, or our position requires you to initiate important changes in the software. Tell me about the last time you did that. In our second scenario, there are multiple drives that are mismatched, but the most significantly mismatched is B. The 2 questions below are what the interview guide generates for the B drive. Our software engineer position is one that requires low B behaviors, heads down, analytical, and objective work that requires lots of alone time. The communication that does happen in this position is more transactional or task-oriented in nature as opposed to building relationships. Since our candidate has a high B drive, we need to get into that gap and make sure that they're prepared to do the type of work that I just described. So the two questions below address that gap. They ask for examples of times that the candidate had to solve a problem with little input from others or had to work alone for long periods of time. Both of those types of things are adaptive behaviors for folks with high Bs. If you need to make the questions more specific, you can always think of specific types of problems that a candidate would need to solve by themselves, or the types of projects that they'd have to work on alone and build your questions around those. For example, you might ask, tell me about the last software engineering project that you carried out on your own. How did that feel? What was it like working without a team? Our third candidate has a clear misalignment on the C drive. Again, this does not mean that our candidate can't do this job, but rather that the pace and prioritization of the job at hand would likely be adaptations for this person's natural work style. The questions below the behavioral comparison get into that gap by asking questions relating to completing projects that took longer than expected. Since a person with a low C, like our candidate has, is predictable to lose patience or have a sense of urgency when things take longer than expected, we want to ensure that they know to prioritize completing all of the necessary steps to get a task done. As always, you are welcome to use these questions as a jumping off point to talk about pace and priority specifically in your world. For example, you might ask a question like, tell me about your last project that took longer than the allotted timeline. What did you do to make sure that all the steps were completed, but still in a timely manner? Our last mismatch is on the D drive. Since this position requires high D behaviors like accurate, detail-oriented work, we want to ensure that our candidate is used to working within established parameters and reducing or eliminating error. That's why the interview guide asks questions about working within existing rules and procedures and working within organized systems. These behaviors will be adaptive for an individual with a lower D. Folks with lower D drives tend to behave in ways that are more flexible or less by the book. So we just want to make sure that this person is used to adapting. Feel free to think specifically about the types of systems, rules, and procedures that the candidate will likely have to follow, and then use the questions from the guide to help structure questions more specific to your world. For example, you might ask a question in this particular case about the software engineer about, tell me about a time that you had to work on someone else's timeline through someone else's systems to make sure that your project was done according to their expectations. If you need more guidance on how to craft great interview questions, ADVISA has an awesome resource that will help. It's a full PDF guide, drive by drive, on crafting those questions in a way that makes sense for your interview. Just head to our client resource page at www.advisausa.com/client-resources. Then you'll click on Hiring and Interviews, and then click on Behavioral Interview Questions. Then you'll be able to download that guide and take a look at all of our suggestions and best practices for conducting a really, really thorough behavioral interview. Thank you so much for watching, and we really hope that you found this guidance to be helpful. If you need any other help or have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the folks on your team that have been trained in PI. They're more than happy to help you. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.